Well, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ben Allen, and I am the chairman of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus. And we mourn and remember the life of Lori Gilbert Kay, who was tragically gunned down at her place of worship on Saturday, trying to protect her rabbi. This incident shattered the illusion of safety of people of faith in our nation nationwide. The Poway congregants were celebrating Passover, a wonderful holiday honoring the liberation of the Jewish people, reminding us of the importance of fighting for freedom for all. Our Jewish community, of course, was just reeling from the recent Pittsburgh attack. And after a second synagogue shooting in just 6 months, many of us are feeling very fearful. There's no question that places of worship should be safe. And there's no question that today, as we celebrate, as we commemorate, as we memorialize the victims of the Holocaust, we realize that the lessons of that tragedy have still not fully been felt. That dark flame, that dark fire that led our people to the end of those tracks in Auschwitz into the gas chambers still continues to flicker today in our beautiful cities, Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, and now Poway. As acts of hate-motivated violence soar, we must do more to secure our places of worship and other vulnerable nonprofit spaces. We know that we can't prevent every attack, but yet we know that when we educate people about the Holocaust, we can build a coalition of allies to help fight that fire of anti-Semitism. Like those Orange County high school students who celebrated around cups in the shape of a swastika, arms raised in Nazi salutes. They didn't know that they were fueling the fire. But the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust invited them to go visit. And afterwards, after a heartfelt moment with many Holocaust survivors where they were able to grapple with the implications of what they'd done and said, they then wrote letters acknowledging the harm they caused, and many of them were in tears. If only the Poway shooter had had such an experience. Our Museum of the Holocaust, which brings in 20,000 students every year, is severely over capacity. We need to help them expand their educational programs. But let's be clear, we're not in this alone. The Pittsburgh shooter targeted the Tree of Life Synagogue because of their support for Central American migrants seeking asylum in America. The Poway shooter was inspired by the Christchurch shooter who murdered Muslims in cold blood. So we're in this together. And hatred against any one of our communities marks a threat to all of our communities. So our Jewish Caucus is advocating for two things that we can do right now. We need to expand our nonprofit security grant program. We need to support the Museum of the Holocaust expansion to increase their educational capacity, and all the educational initiatives that we're working on with the Department of Education right now to help to teach the next generation, to not let them down. This generation of millennials, most of whom have never heard of Auschwitz, a quarter of whom don't even know what the Holocaust is. We're gratified by the broad support of powerful allies gathered here today to help us put out this dark, dark fire of anti-Semitism.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Jesse Gabriel. I'm the vice chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus. Have the privilege of representing the West San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, a district with a large and vibrant Jewish community that has been deeply impacted by recent events. I wanted to first begin by thanking our governor and his staff for their incredible support over the past couple days. The governor has been a great friend to the Jewish community and has demonstrated incredible leadership, and we are certainly grateful to have his leadership at this moment. I also wanted to acknowledge Brian Mainshine, the assembly member from San Diego who represents the community of Poway. I know that he really wanted to be here today. He is a co-author of the legislation that we're working on and has supported our budget request. But he is actually at the funeral today down in San Diego. He was very close with the rabbi at the Chabad there and with many of the congregants, and so unfortunately is unable to join us today, but I know that he is with us in spirit. As Senator Allen mentions, today is an interesting confluence of events because it's the day that we had chosen to have Holocaust Remembrance Day here in the Capitol, and so we were privileged to be joined today by a number of Holocaust survivors, the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and Jewish communal leaders from across the state. And it just so happened that we put together a video this year for our Holocaust Remembrance Program. And the beginning of the video began with news clippings of all of the recent acts of anti-Semitism that have occurred in the United States and a number here in California. We finished that video on Friday, and then we had another incident yet on Saturday that wasn't able to make it into the video. I'm here to discuss primarily a bill that I'm carrying, AB 1548, which would codify the California Nonprofit Security Grant Program and appropriate $15 million to that program. For the past couple years, the state of California has provided supplementary funding to a federal nonprofit security grant program, but this would formally establish that program in the state of California and dramatically increase its budget. This is a program that provides funding to nonprofit institutions that are at risk of hate-motivated violence. These are not just Jewish community institutions. These are mosques and churches, synagogues, museums, health centers, anyone that law enforcement judges would be at risk of hate-motivated violence. And after the events in Pittsburgh and the events in New Zealand, it became abundantly clear to our Jewish caucus that we needed to do a lot more to protect communities at risk of hate-motivated violence. And so we introduced this legislation. We have also made a budget request for $15 million. Last year it was funded at $500,000, but we think that there's a lot of reason to increase that funding. And we're extraordinarily grateful for many of the folks that you see assembled behind us here, non-Jewish members of the legislators from all faiths and backgrounds who have signed on to a letter supporting that budget request. And we believe that this is really important because the most basic and fundamental obligation of government is to protect its citizens. And it has become abundantly clear to us that we need more than thoughts and prayers to keep us safe from hate-motivated violence. And our community is unwilling to accept this as the new normal. I know it feels on some days like our world is unraveling, like every day we wake up and read about another act of hate-motivated violence, but we cannot accept this. We cannot accept this new normal. We believe that everyone should feel safe and comfortable in a house of worship regardless of their faith. So we as a caucus are working on this priority. We are proud to have worked closely with the Muslim community, the Christian community, the LGBT community, the African American community, other communities of faith on this joint request, and make sure that we are protecting communities here in the state of California. And one important point about this funding in California is that the federal program only provides funding to institutions in specific urban areas. And so this means that a mosque in the Central Valley or a synagogue or a health center in a rural community would be ineligible for those funds. And we know oftentimes it's those smaller institutions that have the least capacity and the least access to resources to make those security improvements. So we're very grateful to the governor for his leadership. This is a conversation that we had with him when we met with him as a caucus earlier this year, and very grateful for the other folks here who are supporting this request.
Thank you all so much for coming out. Particularly, let me thank the leadership of the state, demonstrable example of the feelings represented, not only here in Sacramento, but represented by hundreds of millions of Americans that are exhausted with the violence, exhausted with the hate, exhausted with the platitudes, the inadequacy in terms of the response to address our fundamental fate that is tied together. And I say that as governor of the most diverse state in the world's most diverse democracy. I say that from a position of real pride. We live in a state where 27% of us are foreign born. We're a state of refuge, a universal state at our best. I've said this on ad nauseum occasions. At our best, we don't tolerate that diversity. At our best, we celebrate that diversity. Pluralism. We practice pluralism. We are a pluralistic society, and we recognize that we are all better off when we're all better off. That said, we're not immune from the kind of violence, the kind of hate that we see in headlines not only across this country, as was exampled, but around the rest of the world, not least of which New Zealand, Quebec, and other parts of the globe. Anti-Semitism is on the rise around the globe, in Europe in particular, and here in the United States of America. ADL is coming out with new statistics, coincidentally tomorrow. I'll save the announcement for them, but take all the stats you have. They need to be updated in 24 hours. They're exponentially worse than you've been led to believe. The official stats are much worse than you've been led to believe. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. To be fair, it was on the rise before Trump took the oath of office, but they have accelerated. Hate has been weaponized. The racial purity that is being advanced, that has been rhetorical, it's been found in words, now is being advanced in action in ways that have connected a trend line that self-evidently is today's and yesterday's headline. And so the question for all of us is, what are we going to do about it? We're not victims of fate. We can manifest a brighter future. That's California. That's the fate we all hold in common, and that is a sense of purpose, agency, to set a different tone and tenor, and to advance a brighter future. And it's in that spirit that I want to pick up on Jesse's comments. I want to make this easy on you. I won't worry about the legislation because we can simply pass an appropriation. And I am in the process of 3 days of meetings to prepare for the May revise. In the May revise will be that $15 million appropriation to secure those grants. And let me thank all of you for that. Let me thank you for your leadership. You mentioned, and Ben and others, we all were there at the mansion, 3 weeks ago, talking about this specific request. Never could we have imagined doing it a day or two after an incident in our own state. But it was self-evident the need to do more. Just $500,000 last year. $8 million was requested in appropriation. Only $500,000 could be met. $4.5 million in the last 3 years. But as was noted, that money pales in comparison to the need for mosques, for synagogues, for other institutions. This state will do what the federal government is not doing, and I want to highlight that because it deserves to be highlighted. The Trump administration cut their domestic budget to address the issue of domestic terrorism by close to 80%, 80%. That's a demonstrable expression of the proposition of how they value and prioritize this issue. If they won't do that work, we will step in to that position of leadership. That's what we do. That's who we are. That's what California represents. We need to do, though, more than just provide grants for cameras, for locks, to harden facilities, to provide personnel. But we also need to do more in addition to education. We need better data collection. And one of the issues that was highlighted in the Department of Justice was the inadequacy of some of our data collection, particularly as it relates to hate crimes. We appropriated in the January budget, and hopefully with your support, we'll see that approved, close to $1 million to improve some of our efforts in that space. We also have included in the budget some $20 million of additional money for our police officers' standards and training post. While a lot of that money was intended to use for implicit and overt bias and de-escalation, incredibly important issues, that money also can be used to train law enforcement, particularly local law enforcement, as it relates to issues that came to a fore. You saw, by the way, I thought the extraordinary leadership displayed by Sheriff Gore in the San Diego region. Sheriff Gore was actually trained by the ADL and others. He was a living example of the kind of training and how that will manifest in a sensitivity and a capacity of understanding, a depth of understanding, ability to communicate from the law enforcement prison as the sheriff did. I think that's an example we can spread throughout the state of California as well. Look, we have task forces already. We've been working with OES on some task forces that need to be updated and need to be, I think, recalibrated. And you will hear more tomorrow about what the Office of Emergency Services will be doing on recalibrating our violence extremism task force, which, by the way, needed to change its name anyway. Frankly, it comes out of some of the old 9/11 paradigm, but it has not necessarily been as inviting as a task force as it could be. There's been some real issues about the use of our language and our approach, and I think this has opened the door, certainly over the weekend, it opened the door for a different dialogue with our team at OES, and we will be enhancing and advancing that task force as well to highlight and focus on the issues of hate crime in a much more deliberative and, yes, transparent way, protecting civil liberties, and protecting against those concerns about people feeling that they are being disproportionately called out, making sure that we balance those concerns in a more enlightened way. That's what we're going to do in the short run. But I will say this, as a state that, because of the leadership behind me, has led the nation in anti-hate crime legislation, program passing is not problem solving. You got to change culture. Can't just change laws. It's not just about money, it's about a mindset. And that's why I think Ben's point about education, perhaps foundationally, is the most important point we can make. My 7-year-old son came in on my mother and father's grave last week asking me if we were Jewish. And I said, why? He says, well, a friend of mine said he can't stand Jewish people. I said, he's a friend of yours? He said, yeah. And he's been very negative, and because he has a lot of uncles and aunts that are Jewish, he asked if he was Jewish. I said, no, many members of our family are Jewish. And he goes, he just won't stop talking about being anti-Jewish. He's a 7-year-old boy in our backyard. You can't, we all live with this. You can't make this stuff up. What the hell's wrong with us? We're so much better than this. And that's a kid. That's the next generation. If we don't attach ourselves with some sense of urgency to those conversations and get into those conversations in a more enlightened way, then we're just going to be playing whack-a-mole. We're going to just be responding to crisis after crisis. We have to deal with the underlying issues as well. And so I appreciate the early conversations we've had with Tony Thurman. He can talk more about some of the ideas that he looks to advance. There is a lot of interesting curriculum in the space, but it is not spread. It is not scaled as it should. And I want folks to know those conversations are also happening with the sense of urgency in addition to everything else you've heard. Final words. I just want to thank again. I love this legislature. I love the Assembly and Senate leadership because they get it. These weren't phone calls we had to make. This was who got the call first. That's the kind of state we have. And it's a point of pride. I'm new. I'm a new governor. But I am incredibly proud of this state and its leadership. And we are united as a state, condemning hate, condemning anti-Semitism, condemning bigotry. And we are more than capable of leading a conversation anew, not only for the state of California and our 40 million residents, but to light up a different conversation across this country. And so it's in that hope and expectation that we never have to be back at a press conference like this. And again, I congratulate all of you for a job well done and the job we have ahead of us in the next legislative session. With that, the Lieutenant Governor of California.
Thank you, Governor. I'm Eleni Kounalakis, Lieutenant Governor. My time in Hungary as the United States Ambassador really helped to formulate my understanding of the importance of remembering the Shoah. And for those of you who don't know, Hungary had one of the worst chapters of the Holocaust. About 424,000 Jews were deported in 1944 over a period of only about 8 weeks. And I learned about this before I got to Hungary. But when I arrived, I really set about trying to understand what kind of circumstances, how could such a thing happen? And I think more than anything, what I learned is that the pathway to never again, never forget, isn't just calling out acts of anti-Semitism when they are egregious, overt, and deadly, like last weekend, but calling out the acts of anti-Semitism when it is subtle, not looking away, not ignoring it, not shrugging it off, not considering it someone else's problem. And I'll tell you, having been now to several of our UC and CSU campuses over the last few weeks, as I visit all of them in my capacity as a UC regent and CSU trustee, I've had an opportunity to meet with students on campus. And we have a problem on our college campuses in this state. There is a growing movement that is rooted in anti-Semitic feelings. And I urge the legislature that as these funds are allocated, to recognize that we must combat all forms of anti-Semitism, and particularly look to root it out on our college campuses and educate our students, educate our children to understanding the horrific acts of the Shoah. And that is truly the pathway forward to never forget and never again. Thank you. And our next speaker is Senate Pro Tem Tony Atkins.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Lieutenant Governor. You know, a number of the comments that I intended to make today have already been said, so I'm not going to repeat what's already been stated. But I do want to thank certainly Senator Allen, Assemblymember Gabriel, and our Legislative Jewish Caucus for the leadership to help protect our places of worship and other targets of hate. You know, I don't know, we have a long list of people speaking, but being from San Diego County, I recognize my colleagues, in particular from San Diego County, Dr. Weber, Mr. Gloria, my assembly member, certainly Lorena Gonzalez-Fletcher, and Mr. Jones, who's going to speak in a few minutes. You know, it is Mr. Jones's district, Poway. It borders mine, but I would speak for all of my colleagues when I say we feel this profoundly and personally, what happened in our community. It is one too many. It should not happen. You know, on the floor today, I said this is a day that we typically get to pay tribute to the memory of the Holocaust and how we want never to see that happen again in our lives. And while it's a solemn occasion, it's one that I usually really enjoy because we get to touch history directly. And I said on the floor, as I grew up in Southwest Virginia, I didn't have that experience. It was a pretty homogenous community. But in California, I've been able to touch history, whether it be to talk with people who actually knew Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, Harvey Milk, on and on and on, to actually get to touch the history and understand what it means to be from a community that has been looked down upon. Let's not forget women who have suffered, Native Americans. The comments of my colleagues on the Assembly floor and the Senate floor today were profound. And it was more solemn than it typically is, because while we wanted to pay respect and remember and say never again, today felt heavy because of what happened in our community in San Diego. So our prayers alone won't right this horrific wrong or prevent the next tragedy. But what the governor has said, what the caucus has said, what my colleagues have said in the Assembly and the Senate and the Lieutenant Governor here today is a unified voice that we intend to look at every measure that we can to make sure that we understand what it means to feel safe in our churches, in our schools, in our movie theaters, every community place that we meet. And so I'm honored to be with my colleagues today. And like the governor, I feel really honored to be with this group of folks who really want to get it right. And with that, I want to introduce my legislative partner, Speaker Anthony Rendon.
Thank you. Good afternoon. On several occasions, I've had the sobering experience of visiting concentration camps in Central and Eastern Europe. In Nazi camps, people were forced to work until they died, but over the gates of many were the sadistically ironic words, "Work will set you free." But we know that the opposite was true. It is impossible to remove the stain of those words, but we have to remove the stain of anti-Semitic violence. It will only happen if we remember that past and if we work to end the violence. We need to work to be free of the hatred that we saw in Poway over the weekend. If we apply ourselves to justice, that work will free everyone from violence. This is our challenge. This is our dream. But in California, this is our duty. Now I'd like to introduce Senator Hannah Beth Jackson.
Good afternoon. I come before you as the past chair of the Legislative Women's Caucus, as a proud member of the Jewish Caucus, as a Bubba, grandmother, and as one of the more senior members of this community of legislators. And I just can't help but feel the deep sadness that here in California, a state which exemplifies diversity in this country that was founded on a principle of religious freedom, that we are yet here again with an act of hatred, an act of senseless violence that we have seen increasing more and more over the course of time, and in a world where people are murdered because they wish to celebrate and worship God, to achieve that spiritual level of respect and connection, and to be slain, to be brought down by the kind of hatred that we are seeing growing greater and greater and greater in this country and in this world. And you know, they say that the fish rots from the head. And I have to say that we have seen a level of hatred and partisanship. We have seen a level of disrespect, of mocking other people for their beliefs, for what they look like. It is so disheartening. As someone who grew up coming from a family that escaped the pogroms of Eastern Europe back in the 1890s and early 1900s, as so many immigrants came to this country to escape famine and fear and violence. And yet, we lived through the Holocaust of 6 million Jews, many of whom are not remembered anymore. Students today don't necessarily believe it. We've got Holocaust deniers while our Holocaust survivors are dying out. We had the incident in Pittsburgh literally 6 months ago. We've had the bombing of black churches that have gone on for decades. We have the Muslim mosques that are being attacked. Why? Why is the question? And as the governor has pointed out, and I want to thank him directly, this is something that has become endemic, and we have got to root it out. And so I hope as we go forward that we recognize that we must teach our children well. There is no 7-year-old who came into this world being anti-Semitic. There is no 7-year-old who came into this world hating people because of the color of their skin. There is no 7-year-old in the world who believed that their future would be one where they would shoot and kill other people. We have got to do better. And so on behalf of my brothers and sisters, on behalf of my grandchildren, on behalf of my Bubba and Zeta, who came over to this country with the hope and belief that this would be a place where if you worked hard and you played by the rules and you did your best, anything was possible. This was a country that would respect us, that would honor us, that would give us all an opportunity for a better life. Here in California, I do believe that we are committed to that, and I want to thank my colleagues and this governor for articulating that. We can do better. We must do better. It is one world. We are one humanity. And if we do not fight for both, we will end up with nothing. Thank you. Senator Brian Jones.
Good afternoon. I want to first thank the governor and the speaker and the Senate Pro Tem for allowing me to have this opportunity. Last night when I was at the community vigil in Poway, I promised the rabbi that I would tell his story today. So thank you for letting me keep my promise. I appreciate that. As a nation and a world, over the last century, we have fought off organized aggression and oppression in 2 world wars. We've repeatedly battled against terrorism, yet as a society, we still suffer from indescribable evil and hateful acts, such as the tragedy in Poway in my district over the weekend. An almost random, twisted perpetrator, so full of hate, entered a place of worship and turned it into a battle zone. In the midst of utter chaos, we witnessed unbelievable heroism. Jonathan Morales, an off-duty Border Patrol agent, and Oscar Stewart, an Iraq War Army veteran, were in the synagogue during the Passover service and did not hesitate to step up. Oscar ran toward the fire when he heard the gunshot. It was his military instinct. He yelled at the gunman and caught up to his vehicle. Jonathan happened to be armed that day and fired at the gunman's car as he was driving away. Both of these men risked their lives and prevented the shooting from becoming even worse. I met Noya Dahan at the community vigil last night. This 8-year-old girl was one of the victims that was shot on Saturday, but showed her irresistible cheerfulness and charm, and she is full of life as she encouraged all of us at the vigil to heal together and remember Lori Gilbert Kay's legacy. She even walked up and held the rabbi's hand, helping him to finish out his comments for the evening. I was also honored to meet Noya's uncle, Almog Peretz, who was also shot on Saturday. Noya and Almog are recovering after being released from the hospital, and they still used every ounce of energy they had to attend last night's vigil and bring our community together. In fact, Almog with a wounded leg had to jump over a chain link fence to be greeted by the rabbi. We helped him over. I agree with Lori's friend, Ronit Lev, who said of Lori, she, for us, is a holy person. Words cannot adequately describe and honor such a heroic sacrifice. We should stand in humble silence and solemn gratitude that such people walk on earth with us today. Right now, our community in Poway is mourning and full of sorrow. And right now is actually the memorial service for Lori. But I thank God for the healing and the comfort He will provide to all of us in this moment of tragic loss. And I thank Him for providing us with leaders like Rabbi Goldstein, who inspires us to remain hopeful. And I shared on the Senate floor that I have a new hero in America today, and it's Rabbi Goldstein. He said, "I guarantee you, we will not be intimidated or deterred by terror. Terror will not win." And I want us all to understand that he said those words moments after he lost his finger in one hand and a bullet hole in the other hand. Terror will not win. He went on to say, "I am on a new journey. Living without a limb, I will be reminded every day of the vulnerability of life and the heroism we all need. The heroism is standing up to evil, standing up to darkness. No matter what happened, we are going to keep our freedom. We are going to grow from it." And lastly, he said, "It's necessary in life. We can't just be a bystander. We need to be an activist and get out there and be a hero. Light pushes away darkness." Rabbi Goldstein, my new hero. Latino Caucus Chair Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher.
So much of anything that can be said has been said, but I have to add that as chair of the Latino Caucus, we know that the Jewish community put itself at risk by becoming undeniable partners in our attempt to welcome refugees from Central America, particularly in San Diego. You know, I had the great honor of spending my Christmas morning with the pro tem Senator Atkins, along with members of the Jewish Caucus, as we toured and served refugees from Central America. And that shelter that sits in San Diego is actually run by Jewish Family Service. And it's the fact that they refuse to forget their own history of being refugees. And they knew that on top of all the anti-Semitism, everything that is happening, that they were adding another layer for white extremists to hate them. And that's because they are welcoming with open arms people from another country fleeing hate and violence. The Latino Caucus will never forget how they stand with us, and we will continue to stand with the Jewish community in San Diego and statewide throughout our nation as we say enough is enough. Thank you. Next is the Black Caucus Chair, Shirley Weber.
I am honored not only to represent the Black Caucus, but to be here today because of the long-standing relationship that has always existed between the Jewish and the African American community. Because we share so much in terms of oppression, we share so much in terms of rejection in this country, and the long-standing battle for civil rights and equal opportunity and access. Much of what I was going to say, like everyone else, has been said. But I have to remind us consistently the importance of never, ever giving up, and that the battle always continues. When I heard about what had happened, it made me very, very sad, once again. And had a lot of sadness in the last couple of years of things that have happened in this country that I thought I'd never see again, that we'd never have to experience again. And yet it seems to be a recurring story over and over again. And we have to continue to be vigilant and to fight those battles that are so true. And that we have to be there always, always fighting for ourselves. You know, I was thought about the fact of the young man who did this heinous crime. He was 19 years old. And it reminded me to think back and when I served on the school board some 25 years ago. It's been almost 25 years since I was on the school board. And we begged the court not to take us from underneath the auspices of the court, not to let us out of the decree with regards to integration. Because we felt very strongly that while we had made progress, this was something that should always be a part of San Diego City Schools. That without that overlay, that we would get lazy, that we would become indifferent, and that we would dismantle most of the things we had done to create equal opportunity and integration and inclusion of everyone. And so as a board and as a superintendent, we begged the courts not to release us from the decree. They released us anyway. Felt that we had had enough oversight, that we had accomplished our goal. And we knew very clearly that we had not, that there was so much more to do, but not only that, in this country, that is a lifetime struggle. And some of you've heard me say over and over again that inclusion and diversity and respect is a rare flower that has to be constantly watered and nurtured and cared for, but that hatred is a weed that grows best in neglect. And that is so true. And as we look at where we are as a legislature, we have become sometimes comfortable with what we have, and that we have not been vigilant in watching the small things, as was pointed out. It is not the big things. We come together for the big things, and we cry with each other, we commit ourselves with each other, but it's the small things that we have to always be aware of. That some people say you're too sensitive about that. You're too concerned about racism. You're too concerned, every little act is a sexist act or one that's anti-Semitic. And yet we know that it is the small things that give life and growth. And so when I look at the young man who did the heinous act, I realized that he was in that period when we had walked away from integration in San Diego County, that we had stopped doing the things that we thought were important for inclusion of all children, that we had walked away from all of that commitment that we had done for about 25 years and 30 years of work in San Diego. And that time frame of that 25 years, this has been allowed to grow and to fester and now to manifest itself. So if we learn anything from this, is one, not only that we're all in this together, that every small act adds up to a large act, and that we have to be vigilant, because hatred in this community, hatred in this nation, it grows when we become indifferent, when we stop looking at it, and we become neglectful. We are committed to constantly working on this. We have lots of things that is coming before the legislature, whether it's ethnic studies or whether it's issues of security, those kinds of things we can't just brush off. Because this is a generation, these are our children, these are our grandchildren that we want to secure. And we don't want to live in a police state. We want to live in a state where everyone respects each other and that we basically grow and develop as one community and as one nation. I am honored to be here today to lend support to our colleagues, but more importantly, to remind us of the bonds that we've always had that we must maintain as a civilized nation. This gives me great pleasure to present my colleague from San Diego, the LGBT Vice Chair, Todd Gloria.
Thank you, Shirley. Why don't you guys try and go after Dr. Weber? See how easy it is. My name is Todd Gloria. I'm as was mentioned, the Vice Chair of the California Legislative LGBT Caucus, as well as the Assembly Member for the 78th Assembly District in San Diego County. I want to thank all of my colleagues who are here today from all across the state for showing their support for our community in a time of grieving. We appreciate the statewide embrace that you have of San Diego, much as we've stood with many of you when there's been tragedies in your communities. And of course, we'll continue to do this going forward. I want to acknowledge the presence of the chair of our caucus, Senator Scott Wiener, and thank him for his leadership, and say on behalf of the LGBT caucus that we stand with the Jewish caucus, with Senators Allen and Assemblymember Gabriel, to denounce what happened this past weekend. We cannot allow this to become the new normal for California or for our nation. And when people can no longer go into a place of worship and be safe from violence, something has become terribly wrong. But more importantly, there's something that must be done. Our caucus stands in 100% solidarity with the Jewish caucus in support of AB 1548, which would establish California's nonprofit security grant program. And you heard the governor's commitment to this program. This is important, because many of us know that not only is it heinous acts of violence are happening too often in our communities, but increasingly they're happening in the places where you're supposed to be safe. Most of us grew up in a generation where going to church was going to be the place that you could, of course, be safe. We thought that was true of our schools. We thought that was true of our movie theaters, of our nightclubs. Time and again, places of sanctuary have been stolen from us, and it's now to take them back. For many of us in the LGBT community, the first time we ever felt safe was walking into a community center, an LGBT community center. But we know that in this day and age, that may not be true any longer. And so as the governor and as Mr. Gabriel mentioned, we need to step up. And we need to provide these local organizations the safety that they need, the security that they need to provide safety to these vulnerable populations that too often don't have anywhere else to go. So you better believe that the LGBT caucus would stand here today, not only to denounce what's going on in San Diego, but to say that we will do all that we can to make sure that safety, the number one responsibility of government, the safety of the people we are elected to serve, is protected. I want to just close by acknowledging and saying her name, right? Acknowledging the fact that we are standing here in Sacramento, but 500 miles from here, a community is gathered to mourn Lori Gilbert Kay. And I acknowledge my colleague, Assemblymember Brian Mainshine, for being there on behalf of the legislature. Lori Gilbert Kay, who is simply celebrating Passover in her synagogue. A San Diegan who is no longer with us. We can and must do better. And at times, things feel a bit hopeless these days. But I'm here as a part of a state that says very clearly that we will provide hope in these dark times, not by asking for thoughts and prayers, by taking action and making change. I thank you very much. And again, our caucus stands in solidarity with the Jewish caucus. Return the podium back to Assemblymember Gabriel. Or I'd much rather introduce the mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg.
It's been long. Thank you very much, Assembly Mayor. I just want to say, Governor Newsom said it a minute ago, that how proud he is of the state government. Well, I come back, having worked here once, I couldn't be more proud of the governor and the legislature for standing up with conviction here and trying to do all we can to prevent something like this from ever happening again. I don't think it's coincidental. Maybe it is. I don't know. But fate that Yom HaShoah is being commemorated here today. And it's just a reminder that this weekend's unacceptable shooting in Poway is another of many constant reminders of why it is vital that we never forget. The Holocaust was the most extreme and devastating chapter of human history that showed the worst and sometimes the best of humanity, and the universal lessons from the Holocaust never lose their importance. The legislature can never stop commemorating Yom HaShoah. We can never stop teaching. We can never stop fighting hate. We can never stop building community. Elie Wiesel said it best, of course, the late, great Nobel laureate, that the opposite of love is not hate, but it is indifference. And we must always stand up for our precious Jewish faith. We must stand up for all other faiths. We must stand up for each other, and we must stand up for those treated badly because of who they are and those too often forgotten. And I always try to remember another lesson taught by those who suffered the most. The greatest rebuff of the haters is to live lives of joy, to live lives of faith, to live lives of fellowship and community, and to never cower in fear. For cowering in fear and retreating is exactly what they want. In memory of the victims, gone for almost 70 years, and all those who have suffered, including Ms. Kay, who lost her life celebrating Passover yesterday, and all victims of hate and terror, let us all commit ourselves, no matter where we serve, no matter how we serve, to healing this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Steinberg. I just wanted to close by thanking all of my colleagues for their support, for their powerful words. It's incredibly meaningful to the Jewish Caucus and the Jewish community in the state of California to have all of these other communities united in solidarity with us, and we are extremely grateful for that support. You know, it's interesting, we all are connected on this planet, and I felt this very powerfully this weekend when our next door neighbor texted my wife. And it turned out that she was the college roommate of the woman who passed away in San Diego. This incredibly powerful and visceral reminder. The woman that lives next door to me in the San Fernando Valley, hundreds of miles away, is the college roommate of the woman who was killed in San Diego at the shooting at the Chabad. And that is this reminder, as you heard from so many of the other caucus chairs, that we are all in this together. And so part of what we're doing today is not just about protecting any one community or faith communities. It's about protecting anyone in the state of California who is at risk of hate-motivated violence. That means Jews are standing up for Muslims. That means Christians are standing up for LGBT folks. Anyone who is at risk of hate-motivated violence, the leadership of the state of California is going to stand up and protect them. And I want to express in particular my incredible sense of gratitude to the leadership of our state, to both chambers of the legislature, and to our governor. And you heard his powerful words. I'm so proud of this governor. I'm so proud to live in this state under his leadership. And it's not just his leadership of the levers of government and what he does on public policy, but it's his moral leadership. And the fact that on so many issues that are challenging our world and our planet right now, he stands up and expresses a moral voice so that California can lead on these issues. So Governor Newsom, we are incredibly grateful not only for the budget allocation, but also for your incredible moral leadership. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gabriel, a couple questions maybe? Your bill would provide money for security guards. Would those security guards be armed? How would they be trained? And would they be union members?
I'm sorry?
What your bill provides for security guards.
Yeah.
Would those guards be armed? How would they be trained? And would they be union members?
The bill as it currently states is that folks could apply, right? And so it would be clear in their application process what the money would be used for. And then the California Office of Emergency Services would look at that application. It would make a determination based on a variety of criteria about whether or not to award that funding.
Would they be armed?
I suspect that that's likely to be the case in most situations, but that's going to be up to the determination of the Office of Emergency Service about whether or not to make that particular grant, and that would be included in the grant information.
And would they be union members? Would they
Again, that's something that I think that the Office of Emergency Service would have to make that determination.
Governor, I have a question. So just today we saw a story that the FBI had thwarted an attack by a man who was planning to bomb a white supremacist rally in Long Beach.
Yep.
That attack, this planned attack, was in retaliation for New Zealand. So my question is, it seems like we're getting a lot of like retaliatory attacks.
Yeah.
Are you what authority, like what can the state do to help look into these things? Are you trying to do anything? I know most of it falls along the lines of like the FBI, but is there any role the state can play in trying to detect these attacks? And what is your message to people who might think this is never going to end?
Well, it won't end unless we all call it out. It won't end unless we stand up, stand tall, and change the conversation, change the narrative. Look, specifically, what can the state do? I think it's very likely in this country there's going to be legislation along the lines of the UK. You've seen it in Australia and elsewhere as it relates to social media companies being more highly regulated as it relates to the issues of online hate speech. That's a challenging space for obvious reasons. I think it would be in the interests of the leaders that disproportionately reside in this state to come up here and to work with us in a collaborative spirit, so we don't need to legislate some kind of policing, because no one is better positioned to address these issues where so much of this emanates online than the leaders and directors of these companies. I think that has to substantively be part of a response to your question. That is just one response to your question. You made a point. We had someone in Sunnyvale on Saturday, it turns out, last Tuesday, but we learned more about it on Saturday, that we thought PTSD, another vet, gentleman down Southern California that you referenced, another vet, and allegedly drove into folks because of their religious beliefs, just here in the Bay Area. So you're making the point about this cross current of hate and vitriol that is in the air and needs to be called out. I mean, this idea of a 19-year-old, I mean, you look at his own manifesto, allegedly what is connected to him, and I want to be cautious about what I'm reading, saying, boy, this was easy. I couldn't have imagined doing this just a few years ago. Anyone can do this. That's just jaw-dropping and alarming language. So I think social media, with all of its extraordinary attributes, I think we also have an obligation to begin to address in real time what's occurring. And by the way, it's very relevant to your question as it relates to the FBI, because that's exactly how they engaged this individual and engaged him not just online, but ultimately offline as it relates to his work. And we're able to, fortunately and apparently, stave off a violent act, not only in Long Beach, but potentially in Santa Monica as well. And by the way, it wasn't just about white supremacy. It was also attack on the Jewish community as well.
Governor, as far as that plot foiled today, were you personally briefed about that, or anyone?
Yeah, we got briefed, but it was through OES, through Office of Emergency Services. But the state itself was not directly involved.
Was that, you said you were briefed, was that before the announcement came out?
I'd have to get back to you on the timing of the briefing. Yeah.
Governor, do you know why that grant program funding was reduced to $500,000?
I don't know. I just got here, so 500,000 to 15 million. Do the math. Pretty good increase. Need to do it. It was $2 million the previous fiscal year, $2 million previous to that, so it's $4.5 million since 2016. I don't know why it was reduced down to 500,000. Quite literally, hundreds and hundreds of requests have gone unresponded to because we simply didn't have the money. By the way, this is around lighting, cameras. This is about creating rings of security. It's about hardening facilities. It's quite, specifically about locks. It's about physical barriers that are visible, some that are less visible. But the debate is about flexibility with this grant funding, and I think we should provide flexibility for human capital, not just physical capital investments. The federal government, as you know, has a cap on those grants that they provide, and they are UASI grants, urban area grants, as was noted earlier. So a lot of our rural communities are not the beneficiaries of those grants. Those grants are also limited, but we'd like to collaborate more with the federal government to make sure that we're coordinating some of those strategies. Office of Emergency Services, Mark and his team are already working up on some different language in anticipation not only of Assemblyman Gabriel's bill, but our May revise that's forthcoming and some of the language that will be in the May revise that will be part of the trailer bill. Look, armed, it's the old adage, you heard it, I think, from Dr. Weber. I think it was Bobby Kennedy said, armed camps are not places of peace, for peace plans. But to the extent that one chooses the most appropriate response for their circumstances, I think we should provide that flexibility to those mosques, synagogues, to those that understand the threats in a more localized manner. And to the extent that that is an armed security personnel that's trained, I think that is among many of the appropriate uses, potentially, of the money.
You've criticized the federal government's and the Trump administration's cuts to domestic violence prevention.
I just did. That's correct. Yes.
So when you talked to the president over the weekend, did you ask him about those cuts? Or
We had a long conversation. Well, I don't know, long conversation, but we look. First of all, I expressed it publicly. I appreciated him reaching out, and I've always maintained this at this podium that this is an area where we need to collaborate and coordinate, and there shouldn't be any politics as it relates to making sure people are safe, making sure people know that we're working across our differences to secure people's safety. We did talk briefly about the underlying issues. I don't want to make public a private conversation, but note that I did inquire about his thoughts on these issues, and he's made his public comments more known, not only at the rally, but in the budget. I think that's, again, a demonstration of the commitment. Now, I hope the incidents, not just today, but what occurred in Pittsburgh and what happened in New Zealand, what's happening in campuses, college campuses, as was noted, what's happening across this country, sort of awakens and enlivens the senses, and they consider domestic terrorism with a greater sense of urgency, and they reconsider these funding cuts and re-engage in more collaborative partnerships. It's interesting, the issue of the AR-type weapon didn't come up in this conversation. Issues of gun safety are also front and center. I think it was an appropriate message today to focus on the issue of anti-Semitism front and center, but it is also appropriate to consider the broader issues of our resolve and leadership on the issue of gun safety in this state and how we need to make sure that that's magnified the rest of the country as well.
What do you make of the request that you got on Friday from a group of mayors, including Mayor Steinberg, for more funding for gun violence prevention?
He's waiting outside for me in the hall. So I appreciate that. We're finalizing the next 72 hours the May revise. At least my particular decisions, and then hopefully in next. Well, we have to do it by May 14th, right? So that's a couple of weeks, but I think we may do it a little sooner than that, and you'll see the details of those budget requests. But they're based on the conversations, not just with the mayors, but the counties, and with my own personal engagement over the last 3 months, all up and down the state, focusing on this issue. A big part of it as well will be issues of behavioral health, and hopefully very soon we'll have finally our announcement on our mental health czar in the state. All of these things beginning to come together, and hopefully the budget will take shape in a way that will be favorably received by the legislature, and it will be robust by historic standards, and it should be, because I can assure you, based upon the early indications, the point counts that have been done, the early numbers coming in seem to suggest a trend line, at least some of the major cities, that the numbers are going to be much higher than they were even in previous years in terms of the number of people that are out in the streets.
Mental health, is that going to be broadened at all?
Yes, deeply. I mean, I believe in wellness centers. I believe you got to focus on the issues of adolescent mental health. I believe in early psychosis treatment and screening. We have a different paradigm. We believe in treating brain health early before we punish it later. That's the paradigm to which our plan is built. That's the architecture which we're funding and prioritizing. But that's not my quick excuse for every time there's an act of violence or hate. I think that's often a lazy response, though it certainly begs the question, what possibly is in the mind or imagination of a young person that would conceive that what they're doing is appropriate. That seems maddening to any of us, but we'll understand more fully his history that may have triggered this, and hopefully in that understanding be able to respond more nuanced, in a more nuanced way as to what our appropriate response is. But again, I just want to applaud the Jewish Caucus, thank them for their leadership, and thank you all for taking time and your attention here today.